Hi, it's Brandon from Arabian Armory, and today we're actually going to be talking about myths with leather armor, the history of examples that are real, and some misconceptions that need to stop being permeated. And when I say that, like, I'm fine with these concepts being present in video games, certainly, or sometimes fantasy films, sure, but when you put it and then you try to market this as being historically accurate, that's where it bugs me. So, one thing we're going to talk about is the myth of glancing blows. So, I have my helmet. This is steel for that exact reason. So, I'm not sure how well the camera can pick it up, but if I hold it a little bit closer, it's very heavy. This produces glancing blows, right? It's not a weapon. So, glancing blows happen because this helmet is a hardened piece of steel, and a sword is a hardened piece of steel. And because of the dome and because of that center ridge, if any sword comes in and hits that, it's going to deflect away. That is what creates the glance. If I made a steel helmet like this in its exact shape and its exact design, but instead of steel I use something like tanned leather, vegetable tan, right, as opposed to chromium tan, that's not going to deflect anything. I can cut this with a box cutter. Like, I can take, if I have a box cutter around me, it looks like I don't have one immediately available, but here, even better. Not even a box cutter, right? And I can do that. Box cutter, leather, gone. Wire cutters. Okay, that's not going to stop a sword. And a lot of people will also try and come back with, well, a box cutter is sharper than almost any sword because it's very, very thin piece of metal that's sharpened versus a sword which is much thicker, which is reasonably true. Many swords are going to be duller than something this thin. But also consider that this, I'm cutting the leather by just flicking my wrist up and down. A sword, you're going to be swinging with your wrist, your elbow, your shoulder, you're rotating your hips, your entire body weight is being put behind that sword versus just flicking my wrist. The point remains, this is not going to protect you the way steel will. Glancing blows do not happen with leather. Another version, another interpretation of what glancing blows can really mean is the idea that a glancing blow is they just narrowly miss you, right? Well, if I'm wearing something on my arm and something just narrowly scrapes the leather, and they're like, oh, that leather protected you from a potential wound. No, it didn't. Because if I wasn't wearing the leather in the first place and something had just come by, it would hit the air around my arm. It wouldn't hit the actual arm. That's not an injury. It didn't protect me from anything at that point. Leather armor, in the way that it is presented in almost every case, is historically nonsensical. It's, from a physics perspective, just nonsensical. Now, examples that are historical, that leather was incorporated, is not the basis of the armor in and of itself, necessarily, but it could be incorporated, is something like a brigandine. So I can take leather like this, and I can take scrap pieces of steel for making plate armor. And those small pieces, however big they are, usually about the size of my hand and not much bigger, although many times smaller, I can rivet them on the inside of the leather. And all of those overlapping steel plates together are a semi-flexible, reasonably adjustable kind of armor. That's what brigandine is. And that's also where the myth of studded leather comes from. Those are not studs, those are rivets. And again, it's metal plates that would be on the inside of this. So leather can be used as a base that you rivet leather to. That would be also used in splint armor. Difference between splint and brigandine is that the brigandine, the metal plates, are on the inside, splint, it's on the outside. Or alternating outside, inside, outside, inside. That's another way of doing a splint. So, what are ways that you can make leather by itself at least a little better? One way that was done historically is you harden it by boiling it. And I don't mean boil it like you're cooking corn. Okay, you have a very controlled temperature. You have to have some additives in what you're boiling it with. That can also help it. If you think about rawhide is a leather product. It's not exactly what tan leather is. But the concept of rawhide from a physics perspective is when you hit it, it's very similar to bone. Now the problem with rawhide is, and the reason why we give it to dogs, moisture from saliva or from water or anything like that That will soften rawhide. And if your goal is to protect yourself, you don't want your armor to be soft. You want it to be about as hard or harder than whatever is coming into contact with it. So, hardening the leather using that boiling and treatment process, that keeps it similar to rawhide while making it resistant to absorbing water and thus becoming soft again. Mongolians were one culture that used that kind of boiling process. They would make the lamellar scales out of bits of rawhide, although they typically preferred to get iron, if they can get iron, because it was just a better material to be working with. It was more durable, it was a little bit thinner in its profile, and it just looks nicer, certainly. So if you are a high-ranking official in service to Genghis Khan, you would probably want iron if you can get it. Other things that you can do with leather, you can use leather as, because this is going into like availability of leather in the medieval period and classical times for Bronze Age as well. You can use leather as soles for shoes, right? Instead of, because they didn't have rubber soles like we have today. Or you can use it for clothing, or you can use it for the saddle on a horse. There's many uses of leather. So many, in fact, that using leather for armor is a bit wasteful. Compare that to a gambeson or an arming doublet. These are kind of like a sweater, but 20, 30, 40 layers of linen or canvas or some similar material. Something that is very, very padded. So if you get hit something like a bat or a mace, something like that, it's going to take a lot of that impact away. Gambesons that are intended to be worn on their own are going to be a bit thicker than one like an arming doublet, which would be paired with armor. So you'd put plate armor on top of an arming doublet. It has arming points on it, that's why it's called arming doublet. But the point is, it's a textile armor. Now, if you think about the kind of plants that you would use to make canvas or linen, you can grow a field of that in your backyard, and after, well, depending on how big your property is, and after a single season, you can harvest that, and then you could make the gambeson. Compare that to leather. Leather, like we're talking about here, comes from cows. A cow can live very, very long time, and you'd need multiple years before a cow is big enough to actually get usable amounts of leather. If you compare medieval cows to modern cows are noticeably heavier because we've bred them over centuries to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So to get a cow of appropriate size, it would take more of its lifespan in the medieval period, not dramatically more, but a couple of years more, than it would today. So you could grow the kind of plants to make a gambeson, canvas and linen-based textile armor, in a single season, for a cow to be big enough that you can use it maybe 7 to 10 years. That's a pretty big difference. That's a massive investment that you are losing. So leather armor is just financially not viable. It's, from a resource perspective, if you have to be completely out of gambeson-based materials for leather armor to start making sense again. And that really doesn't happen. If your fields are burned and you don't have any of that fabric-based plant, or plant-based fabric that you can gather anymore, well, then your cows are probably dead. Right? The enemy is not going to just burn your fields and then leave your cows. They're going to take the cows. Or at the very least, they're going to kill the cows because they don't want you to have that. So it's just, there's no rationalization that you could really come to for leather armor making sense. And that even applies to fantasy. Because if you look at fantasy, right? If you're making leather armor, you have to have a tool to cut it, right? And in the fantasy world, if something equivalent to whatever a box cutter is can cut it, that's not going to stop a sword. That's just not. Now, there's weird... Let's say that it's a fantasy animal. Skyrim has what's leather armor, essentially, from the scales of a dragon. Well, they don't really go into what kind of tool it takes to do that. It's the same generic animation for making any kind of armor. But if you try to rationalize it with, you need something like the claw or bone of a dragon sharpened to cut the scales of a dragon such that you can make leather armor, that is at least something that kind of sort of makes sense. Because now you're introducing a fantasy world wherein a steel box cutter or razor blade equivalent can't perform the action, where a steel sword can't perform the action, but some kind of magical material can cut this other magical material and work it. That at least makes sense. Another interesting way that you can use leather, although it's shown similar to fabric for some reason, is Inuyasha, actually. So Inuyasha is wearing that red outfit, right? And that's made from the fur of a fire rat. Um, if you're making leather armor on the basis that it's coming from a magical creature, and this magical creature has elemental resistances, that's at least a very good reason to wear it. You can say that it's very light, and it's resistant to fire, or for another animal it could be resistant to lightning, or another one it could be resistant to arcane spells. At least something like that starts to make sense again. Can you use leather from different animals other than cows and get something that's very protective? And the answer to that is yes. So, in the 1800s, and unfortunately going onward, even in the modern day, it was very popular to go to various places in Africa and hunt wild animals there. Now, large game like a rhino or an elephant or a hippo, these things are very, very durable. They're very tough animals. A handgun really can't kill them. They can survive multiple shots from a handgun, and they'll be angry, and they'd probably trample you. So the concept of an elephant gun was invented. Elephant guns being a very, very high caliber rifle, something that can actually injure the elephant. If you use elephant hide, very thick stuff, so thick in fact that comprehensive testing has shown that it can stop bows and arrows. Like an arrow from a bow rated at 120 pounds raw at 28 inches. It'll stop the arrow. Now, the elephant will feel pain, certainly, but the point is if you wore that kind of hide as armor on you, you could have an arrow sticking in you, but it's not actually in your body, it's in the hide of your armor. That comes down to, well, you can cut it, but you have to do multiple cuts over and over and over in the exact same spot because of how thick that material is in order to get through enough. And in that case, yes, you can make leather armor like that. Another that was done historically is if you look at crocodiles. There is evidence archaeologically for crocodile hide armor in the Egyptian culture. For context on just how strong the hide on alligators and crocodiles can be, you can actually shoot one with a handgun. Like in this case, why high caliber rifles are better. If you shoot a gator or a crocodile on where their thick scales are around their skull, the bullet can actually shatter. So something that can stop a handgun, that can probably stop a sword pretty nicely. Obviously, if you get at just the right angle, at just the right range, the bullet will still punch through that and it'll still kill the animal. But that is also a case of shot placement. And again, like, even if you can't fully stop something, consider this. The amount of energy that sword has lost if you're wearing crocodile armor and you get hit there, that turns a blow that cuts you in half into a blow that's an annoying flesh wound. One that you can ignore for a couple minutes, keep fighting. When you're done with your opponent, then you can get medical assistance and probably survive. So yeah, crocodile hide, alligator hide, elephant hide, things like that you can definitely make armor out of. There's another cute animal called a pangolin. People make scale armor from pangolins. Please don't do that. Those are cute animals and they're going extinct because of that. Or armadillos, or turtles. But veg-tanned cow leather is not armor, and you really shouldn't try and market it as such. Another thing that bugs me is, and this is why I really don't recommend people get too much armor online unless they trust and know the source personally. You will go to a certain website, hundreds of them like this, and they will put the initials for various armored combat groups like SCA, or things like that. And the leather that they're using, first off, isn't of an appropriate thickness. Or if it is of appropriate thickness, it's not treated correctly. Or if it's both of those, it's not cut in a certain way. When you cut leather, you want to have clean edges. If you don't have clean edges, then the same way that like a small tear in fabric can gradually grow larger, the same thing happens to leather. Leather obviously is tougher than most fabrics, but you don't want to give something an initial weakness that'll dig out over time. It's better to spend a little bit extra money on armor that you know is going to last you for a couple years than armor that breaks down after a year and a half. Another thing to be important about for working leather is you really shouldn't drill it unless you do it very carefully. Drilling, the problem with that over hole punching is that it's friction, right? And the heat generated from the friction can break down the leather around the hole that you drill. So you don't want to do that too much. Hole punching is generally going to be a better option. But yeah, that's just a lot of stuff I wanted to say about leather and why it's just not armor on its own. You have to pair it with something. Anyways, the next subject we're going to have for another video is going to be splint armor, a little bit more details. And then also Vikings and various things about them. Have a good one.